Good morning.
Good morning.
Again, grace to you and peace to you. The Word About Life is a passage that we are familiar with, and yet not always the easiest to understand, to know, or to live out. And so a lawyer came to Jesus to ask him a question, and really it was not because he wanted to know something. It was because he wanted to test Jesus. Wanted to really put him on the spot, or as Sarah Palin used to say, was a gotcha question. And so the lawyer asked him a question to test him and said, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." The other passage that comes to mind, especially as the adults are going through a study on the Gospel of John and making reference to other writings attributed to John, John in one of his letters said, "You cannot say you love God and hate your neighbor, because if you do, then you are a liar." Now, we've been going through a sermon series encouraging us to be the beloved community that we are called to be. And as you heard in the celebrations, the things that are shared, I think you can say that we indeed do our best to live into this calling to be a beloved community. The first week we said being church is not about where we go, but what reality we create when we come together. And last week I said that we can love and care for each other better when we are aware and loving our true self. And so we were introduced to a tool called Johari's Window. Now, how many of you used Johari's Window this past week against your sibling or against your spouse? No. How many of you used Johari's Window? Okay, we have one. Okay. All right, we'll have to do better than that. The other thing we did is with Johari's Window is you could see where you would look at your open self, your hidden self, your blind self, and your unknown self. And then we took that same tool, and at the brewery service later that evening, we went a little bit deeper and applied the Johari Window to God. That God has an open self, a blind self, a hidden self, and an unknown self. And we discussed the idea that God dwells perhaps most profoundly in our own unknown self. Being a beloved community for each other and for ourselves is keeping each other and our true selves within sight and sound. I use this little phrase, within sight and sound, because it's what we do when we watch the most vulnerable and cherished people in our lives. And I gave you the example a couple of weeks ago about watching our grandchildren, that I need to keep them in sight. And if I don't see them, then I better be hearing them. And if I don't hear them, I better go check on them. And so this past week, it became very clear, in fact, it was Friday, when my daughter Amelia went to pick up Claire, our granddaughter, at school. Claire was actually missing for 17 minutes. It was an incredibly long 17 minutes. Claire had decided on her own that she was going to the after-school program rather than go home. But it took the school and parents a while to find her. Somehow she was not kept within sight and sound. It is affirming for us to experience reality of really being seen and really being heard. And we do this for each other. We do this for ourselves, being a group of people committed to loving and caring for each other. empowered by our own spiritual and emotional growth to know our true selves. It empowers us to love and care for each other. And these are great goals in themselves. And if they were the only goals that we have for ourselves, then we could all sing the Barney song and go home. I love you, you love me, we're a happy family with a great big hug and a kiss from me to you. Won't you say you love me too? And the band could then play, and the camera would pull back, and the credits would start to roll, and off we would go home. The sermon would be done. Don't get excited. But as I said, being a group of people committed to loving and caring for each other, empowered by our own spiritual and emotional growth to know our true selves, are great goals in themselves. However, there's more. We are to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And this means loving ourselves individually and collectively has a purpose beyond just loving ourselves individually and collectively. Such love is for the purpose of loving our neighbor. We are to keep within sight and sound each other. We are to keep within sight and sound our true self. And we are to keep within sight and sound our neighbor. And when we love each other and our true self, we are a great light. And the light that shines the brightest at home is the light that shines the furthest in the world. Cornel West says, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. And this is true. I want to paraphrase the phrase, loving our neighbor is not a warm, fuzzy thing. Loving our neighbor is what justice looks like in the eyes of God. We do a lot of loving our neighbor around here. We love asylum seekers and show it with hospitality. Loving our neighbor is what justice looks like in the eyes of God. We love Misiel Perez and Marco Tulio and Ishmael Delgado, Yvette Coral, and all those kids by working to keep their families together, because kids need their moms. Kids need their dads. Loving our neighbor is what justice looks like in the eyes of God. Our public school teachers are to be esteemed and paid better. We supported the teachers and this truth by going to a neighborhood and providing food for kids when the teachers walked out to leverage their power for justice. Loving our neighbor is what justice looks like in the eyes of God. But to really see our neighbor, to really hear our neighbor, our greatest faithful response is to respond to their despair by pulling their hurt closer and closer until it lives under our roof of love. We do not do this out of pity. We do this out of compassion. Our capacity for compassion grows as we keep each other and our true selves within sight and sound. We love and act with justice because we learn and grow from this action. To see our neighbor, to hear our neighbor, to really love our neighbor is to love ourselves and to love God. And we sometimes fail to do this because we're looking for the big public love action. And sometimes to raise our voice in this way is exactly the right thing to do. However, we are presented with opportunities to keep within sight and sound our neighbor in almost every waking moment. And it is in these ordinary moments when ordinary people show love, that the world is remade and the world is healed. Father Kevin Cullen recalls one of the first times he stepped foot in a L'Arc home as a young Jesuit priest over 40 years ago. A home that gives refuge, place, love, and dignity to people with physical and mental disabilities. He sat down at the table for prayer before dinner and took the hand of a resident named Hazel. It was then that he realized that her hands felt different. Her hands were webbed. Surprised by the unfamiliarity of her touch, he started to let go, to pull back. Hazel's response has remained with Father Kevin to this day. Instead of distancing herself, Hazel held on to his hand a little bit tighter and wouldn't let go. And she leaned in and she said to him, "Don't worry, you're going to be okay." Father Cullen wrote later on that in that moment he realized, I'm not going to do a thing for her. She's just done something tremendous for me. She's just taken away all my fear of feeling something different. Hazel was the neighbor he intended to love, but he ended up being the neighbor being loved. Isn't that our experience? Every time we open up for the preschool, every time we open up for Family Promise, every time we say yes to sanctuary, every time we have asylum seekers looking for an injection of hope, every time we speak up for LGBTQIA persons, every time we act with kindness with one another, that when Mike takes Irene to her appointment, that when we go to Bradford's apartment to clean it out, every time, we think we're loving our neighbor. But the mystery is, the Spirit of life and love uses that act not to transform the person that we are intending to love, but to transform us. And we are better human beings for it, and a greater beloved community for it. You see, the currency, money is an important thing. The currency of love for neighbor is not primarily money or words, although it helps. The currency of love for neighbor is presence, generosity, hospitality, forgiveness, and justice. The currency of love for our neighbor is keeping them within sight and sound. Amen.